Good afternoon and welcome to CEU. My name is Anya Duffy. I'm Communications Director here at the university, and I'm very pleased to welcome you all to this evening's panel on doing research at a time of COVID. Professors Judith Shandor, Miklos Koren, and Michael Dykes' most important work connects with the wider body of research being produced by CEU faculty and students. Research that is directly or indirectly linked to the virus. Please expect to see a lot more work in this area, as some of CEU's and indeed the world's greatest minds apply their expertise to making sense out of what is possibly the biggest global health crisis this world has experienced for over 100 years. You can find out more about CEU's world-leading research on our website at ceu.edu and hear from our researchers on our YouTube channel. Okay, so let me run through the way that we've planned this evening's event. Each of our speakers will give a snapshot of their recent research, and then the panel will discuss how the social sciences can help address and mitigate the health, social, economic, legal, and cultural impacts of the COVID-19 outbreak. We'll have time at the end for a Q&A, and we really want to hear from you. So do please send in your questions. Simply type whatever you want to ask the panel into the question section on Teams, and don't forget to list your team, your location, and your affiliation, and we'll try to put as many as we can to the panel. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our three wonderful speakers. Hungarian lawyer and bioethicist Judith Shandor is full professor at CEU and founder and director of the Center for Ethics and Law in Biomedicine. Judith is the author of numerous books in the field of human rights and biomedical law, and her profile is further cemented with roles at various organizations, including as chief of the bioethics section at UNESCO, during which time she wrote the explanatory memorandum of the 2005 Universal Declaration on Bioethics and Human Rights. Judith has most recently published on the bioethical issues arising out of what to do when medical resources are suddenly in short supply. Next will be Miklos Koren, Professor of Economics and founder of the Business Analytics Masters of Science program and the CEU Microdata Research Group. His research focuses on international trade and economic development. Before coming to CEU, Miklos worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and at Princeton University. And together with Rita Petto, fellow of the Research Center for Economics and Regional Studies, Miklos has most recently published on the role of direct human interactions across different businesses, and this for COVID Economics, a peer-reviewed online journal of the Center for Economic Policy Research. And rounding up our presentations for the evening is Professor Michael Dorsch, an applied economist whose research and teaching interests are mainly in political economics and public economics. Employing formal theoretical modeling and data-driven empirical investigation, Michael's research has appeared in leading academic journals across the quantitative social sciences. Michael is currently serving as the director of the MPA program for the School of Public Policy. And with PhD candidate Reka Baranski and former IAS fellow Gabriele Cepolini, his latest research focuses on political regimes and COVID-19 deaths. So normally this is the part where I would invite you to welcome our speakers with a great big round of applause, but in the absence of that, and without further ado, I'll simply pass over to Judith. Judith.
Thank you very much for the introduction. As we have heard, the COVID-19 is indeed causes of the most complex health, social and economic crisis in our lifetime, and it's also resulted the biggest lockdown in the history. It has called as a term of a public health emergency of international concern. It is not the first time that we use this expression, of course, in Ebola in Congo in 2018, or we use this expression in the context of the Zika virus in 2016 in South America. But I think that there are some specificities of COVID-19 which is important for all of us from different disciplinary background. I think that both in the time dimension and both of this complexity of the COVID-19 is having a lot of lessons, and my field is bioethics and human rights, so I would like to connect these two disciplines. I think that there are at least three areas in which I also did a research based on policy documents. Some of the areas we are still doing research on, for instance, how tracking of social distances can be monitored by not violating privacy measures. But I would like to speak on three different aspects now. One is how this pandemic is shaping our notion of right to health, how we are having a new model from the previously considered me health to something which can be called we health. And I also think that there is a switch in my discipline towards an everyday bioethics. In the last couple of decades, we tend to think about technology-specific bioethics. I myself dealt also with stem cells, bioethic, gene editing, biotechnologies, and also the ethical perspectives. And suddenly we found ourselves some basic questions which we didn't examine or re-examine since the Second World War. And I think we have to revisit these basic questions. And the third dimension, which is, I think, important for us both as people who are teaching graduate students and also in a research, what is the connection between science and society now? Instead of politicization of science, which we could observe in many countries, I think that there is an issue here how science and society should communicate. So back to the first point, to right to health. I think that when we finished the project on the new catalog of human rights, we wanted to have a book launch in March in the European Court of Human Rights. Unfortunately, this book launch was cancelled, but this huge volume, there are already some aspects of right to health, and of course, that time we couldn't envisage that repercussions of the COVID-19 will bring some new lights into the right to health. I think that there was a kind of perception before that if you are rich enough or if you have a good employer, if you can buy a new health insurance, that you are safe. And public health has a different dimension. If you think about who were among those who were infected by COVID-19 virus, the SARS virus, then you can see people of several ministers of health, even nobilities like Princess of Charles. And also you can see people, famous actors, Tom Hanks, Madonna, and others. So even we found out that even the richest person cannot buy for himself or herself of a virus-free environment because it's a collective dimension. So immunity is creating of a global aspect of healthcare, which we tend to forget. Although after the Second World War, when first right to health has been crystallized, and actually WHO was the first organization which wanted to define right to health, there was a consensus that medicine is one of the pillars of peace. They recognize that healthcare and medicine has this very important global dimension. The pandemics reaffirm these elements that we have to again to think about we health, because we cannot solve this issue individually. And I think that there will be a lot of dimension of accessibility of healthcare. We are trying to give more content to these rights, which have been described in the last couple of years, some kind of rhetorical rights, which has no place in constitutions, very ambiguous concept which we should not dwell upon. And bioethics is the other discipline in which I'm also working, and I found something very similar that in the field of human rights, many of the documents, policy documents, professional bodies try to adopt papers as a response to the pandemics. They were all very reductionist. They were thinking at the edge of the scale, how to allocate scarce resources at the end of the procedure, how to allocate ventilators. And of course, they overlooked a whole system of healthcare, should have lessons people who have no COVID infection, for instance. Millions of medical interventions have been cancelled in the world, which had a huge impact for the future healthcare. It has been overlooked because the model in which we were thinking about what are the ethical dilemmas, these were the end-of-life decision to switch on or off the ventilators, and that was the ethical model. And now we have to bring what I call an everyday bioethics, which will be also of a systematic dimension of the changes. And I also would like to mention the third element in which we're also doing some kind of research. This has also have a component both in ethics and human rights. And this is how science and society should be connected and communicated with one another. I think that protection of whistleblowers were many times of an issue which we wanted to include. For instance, also you mentioned the 2005 Universal Declaration of Bioethics and Human Rights. At the end, we didn't include, and now I think many people regret, because if Li Wenliang, the Chinese ophthalmologist, could have told the world earlier that the virus could spread from human to human, not only from animals to human, then we could have been prepared earlier on. And there are numerous other examples now from Brazil when Bolsonaro doesn't want to communicate the data. And I think that in many countries, what we could see that this direct communication between science and society have been disrupted and politicized, even how the numbers and data are communicated to people, not to mention of the transparent communication about these pandemics, which I think it's a very major contribution in trying to fight against the pandemic. If people understand why they have to keep social distancing, they are complying with that. If it's not explained, or the politicians wanted to tell to them, of course, not adequately addressing these issues, of course, people are much less likely will comply with that. So this is the three areas in which I try to do of different types of research, mainly based on the analysis of policy document, but within the World Association of Medical Law, we are also trying to publish comparative studies on different legal measures, because that's also a very interesting story, what's happened in the state of emergency in a couple of countries. Again, a very reductionist view. They were concentrating on the COVID patients, and they overlooked the overall implication of this very complex pandemics. Thank you. That's my introduction in this very rich field.
Judith, thank you so very much. Much food for thought there. I'm particularly thinking about the shift from the me generation to the we generation. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions on that. Thank you. Next up is Miklos. Miklos, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Judith, for sharing your thoughts. I think they were very, very interesting, and I tried to connect to some of those. The perspective that I'm bringing here is that of an economist. And so let me mention a bit of the research that I've been working on. And this is not, at least before the pandemic hit, it wasn't directly related to, like a year ago, I wasn't sure that I'm going to do research related to pandemic. But in the end, it turns out that some of the research that I work on related to urbanization, globalization, international trade, they do relate to pandemics. And so this is something I would like to share with you. So, and basically the way these two phenomena relate is the role of face-to-face interaction. If you think about what the pandemic does, you know, the way the virus spreads is, you know, when people are in close proximity to one another, that's how the virus spreads. So either because people are, you know, caring about others and they do voluntary social distancing, or because there are legal or policy measures that are put in place, stay-at-home orders. But so, you know, shutting down face-to-face interaction has a big effect on the economy. And so that's what we set out to study with a colleague of mine, Rita Petty. But to think a little bit about what face-to-face interaction does and how it has reshaped the economy, not only in 2020, but going a little bit back in time, let's think about how cities have been changing in the past more than 100 years. So this table is from a study of economic historians who looked at data on basically job advertisements in US cities, and what are the verbs that were most frequently appearing in jobs that are advertised in cities. So if you look at the first couple of columns, then in the late 19th century, threading, stretching, these are basically verbs related to jobs in the textile industry, right? So cities were places where a lot of workers came together so that they can engage in industries that are very labor-intensive production processes. But if you look at how these words have changed towards the end of the 20th century, then you will see words like identify, document, analyze, review. And so these are words related to the knowledge economy. So cities by now are mostly about sharing knowledge among one another. And so when we think of cities as part of the economy, we think of service industries and businesses that are relying on having other people in their close proximity in producing their goods and services. Okay, so it's not just kind of a byproduct that we need to put a lot of people here because we need the workers. We actually need them to communicate with one another. So because of that, I think it's very important to try and measure quantitatively, how do people communicate? Can they communicate online like we are doing now, or is face-to-face communication really necessary for them? So this is what we set out to do with Dr. Petter, and basically what we did, using US data, we looked at a large survey of US workers, which asked them about the context in which they do their work. Do they work with others? Do they work in closed spaces, in tight spaces? So all kinds of, lots of questions about how people are working. And we selected indicators that we think can measure the importance of face-to-face communication. And on this figure, what I'm showing to you is two indicators. One is the importance of teamwork. So this indicator would be high if there's a lot of interaction with my coworkers, day-to-day, face-to-face interactions. So this is high for chefs or social workers, dentists. And the other indicator is customer contact. When if you think about, again, healthcare workers need to be able to face-to-face communicate with their customers. And so there's variation across the different types of jobs along these measures. And indeed, if you look at how important these measures are for each industry, and then so we did this study actually mid-March, and then later when the employment data for April came out, we went back and wanted to validate the results of our study. And so our measure of exposure to social distancing policies was highly correlated with the actual change in employment in these industries. So we have seen in the US huge drops in employment in restaurants, hotels, other personal service industries, and these are indeed the industries that are very, very customer facing. Now, these conclusions might not be super surprising, because if you kind of read the news or walk the streets, that's what you see. A lot of these shops are closed, and people are staying at home. They are not eating out. But I think it's still very important, and I'd like to connect to Judith's point about if we're making very, very important decisions every day, then I think it's very important to be able to quantify the costs and benefits. So not just say, hey, tourism is going to be affected or restaurants are going to be affected, but we would like to be able to say, how much affected, but how much. And so this is what we did in this research.
Miklos, thank you very much. Again, much food for thought. Finally, Michael, I'm going to hand over to you, and then we can perhaps have a conversation amongst all of the panelists.
Sure, thank you very much. This is a wonderful event to be involved with, so thanks for considering me and my research, which, as you mentioned, is co-authored with a PhD student here at Central European University, Reka Braninsky. So we're looking at taking a more political angle in our analysis of COVID-19, and I think from Miklós's presentation and from Judith's presentation, it's clear that there are trade-offs involved with formulating COVID-19 response policies. Miklós just highlighted one of the economic trade-offs involved with formulating a COVID-19 response policy, but there are civil liberty trade-offs as well. And I think the main point of our research is that those trade-offs are maybe kind of weighed more heavily in more democratic societies than they are weighed in less democratic societies. And that's kind of what I would like to share with you. So I thought I like this thought experiment that Harari proposed in the Financial Times in late March, and basically he's saying, like, look, we have the technology to devise policy responses that could stop the pandemic. Yeah. The issue is that those technologies and those policy responses are hugely invasive into people's privacy, into people's civil liberties. So he ends the thought experiment with, we can stop the pandemic with these policies. Sounds wonderful, right? And indeed, some societies that are less democratic tended to move in that direction. So here's a picture of the Singapore metro with the individuals kind of dutifully reporting on their smartphones, their whereabouts, and most of them wearing masks. On the other hand, these kind of trade-offs are not as readily accepted in other places. So here's a shot from Michigan, where you see protesters killing small businesses, to Miklós's point, and isolating healthy people as tyranny. Yeah. Finally, impeach Whitmer, who is the governor of Michigan. So both in terms of the public's willingness to accept a policy and in terms of their willingness to pursue policies, it seems that this is kind of an avenue for investigation. So that's precisely what we did. We wanted to know, did more democratic political regimes fare better or worse than less democratic political regimes in containing COVID-19 in the early stages of the pandemic? And we gathered data for the first 100 days of 2020. That's what we determined to be the early days. It was a cross-country study. And yeah, I mean, maybe judging from the pictures, you can you might anticipate some of the results. In countries with higher levels of democracy, we showed them to be associated with greater per capita COVID-19 death tolls, sooner incidence of COVID-19 deaths since the first confirmed case, less stringent policy responses, and policy responses that were less effective at reducing COVID-19 deaths. So all of these results are in the paper. I just want to show you a table on the first result today. And it's the following. So if you just look at maybe column 1, what this is showing you is that countries with an additionally higher point on a democracy scale that we used are associated with experiencing 24% more per capita deaths. The second column indicates that if you just look at a binary measure of democracy, so democracy or non-democracy according to the Freedom House and Polity metrics, the democratic countries experienced 99% more deaths. Yeah, and this is just the result of a simple regression. A lot of the paper is dedicated to establishing the robustness of this result. I show you here now just one. If we include a battery of controls, the result is sticking here. The binary regression table shows us after including controls for the population's sensitivity to disease, the population's vulnerability to disease, and their exposure to the international economy, democratic countries experienced 71% more deaths on average. So I think that I would just like to say that, typically social scientists associate democratic governance with better outcomes, yeah? Better economic outcomes, better health outcomes, better social outcomes. And, we tend to argue this is because there's more informed, more rigorous, more accountable policymaking processes, and that the policies are a better representation of the population's preferences, yeah? Well, while these are good things in normal times, it's possible that these features of democracy that we cherish actually constrain the speed and incisiveness of decision-making in democracies and may delay policy actions that could save many people's lives. In particular, we'd like to point out that policy responses that are infringements on personal liberties and economic freedoms are particularly sensitive in democratic societies and maybe more binding in terms of how they constrain policymaking. So I'm going to leave it there.
Michael, thank you. Again, I'm not sure whether or not this is the sort of research that brings joy to the hearts of those of us working within free and open societies. But there you have it. To start the discussion, you've all touched on the important connections between your own research and the necessary policies that will need to be enacted in your discipline as a result of the virus. Thinking more generally, the pandemic is clearly urgent for policymakers now. So to what extent do you think the crisis will change the way you teach the next generation of policymakers and experts? Miklos, I'm going to go to you there for first response.
So one thing that we learned and was very, very interesting for economics as a profession during this pandemic is how data is being generated, and sometimes you just cannot, especially if you want to give quantitative advice to policymakers, you need to look for different data sources. And real-time data sources that are coming up have become very, very important to look at. So the traditional statistical methods that are collecting these, the kind of surveys that I was using in our research, they are dated back a couple of years. And if you want a very fast response, you need to look at other methods like collecting data from cell phones. But again, this brings up issues of privacy. Now, Google has made available in an aggregated form data about where people are and what places they visit. And so that has every day we can see this data, and it's good for policy, but it brings up these other questions. This kind of data issue also means that I think if we think about going forward and we think about how policy should think about the future, data itself is not enough. So some of the frameworks that we are using to model the economy I think it's important that those are solid frameworks, because we want to predict something that was not totally unprecedented, because in the past we have seen quite a few pandemics, but in very different economic environments, and it's very hard to make predictions and policy advice if you don't have a very good framework, kind of theoretical. So I think theory and data are both necessary. So something that has come up, and that's related, at least in economics, to the emergence of working from home. So one interpretation is that this is going to be great because now we can attend seminars at other universities. I can go to a seminar at Yale and Harvard by just logging on a website, and that's it. And so this is going to be a big equalizer in society, because everyone can access new things if these online methods of knowledge sharing have become more widely available. But I would fundamentally disagree with that. I think what we're going to see is an increase in inequality rather than an increase in inequality. There might be more participation, but there's going to be a lot of focus on people who have already access to these tools, these skills, these networks, these universities, and people in other areas or in minorities who do not have access. And we have seen this in the big experiment of digital schooling a lot of students don't have access to these tools, and then they basically lag behind other students. And so I think this brings the issue of equity to the forefront of thinking about not only policy response, but how economists are thinking about these issues.
Thank you, Miklos. Michael, I see you nodding your head vigorously there. Would you like to add?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think I would add the standard line that political economists have been spewing for quite a while now, is that it doesn't matter necessarily how well you can design a policy if there are political constraints to enacting that policy. And I think that, that's what I take away from the research projects that we've worked on recently, is that policymakers are constrained politically in democracies, and we have to take those constraints into account when recommending policy advice to the decision makers. So that's all that I would add to Miklos's point.
Michael, thank you very much. Judith.
Clearly, there is a different situation than after September 11, when we already got used that there is a trade-offs between security and privacy. But there are some similarities here. But I think what we didn't think about it, that there are some people who are completely happy with self-monitoring practices they got used to without the social credit system in China. So I think that if so far privacy invading technologies which have been implemented for various reasons, now it will be matched with overall biopolitical control, then we can easily find ourselves in a world when full monitoring and also immunity superiority will bring a new eugenic world, when people seem to have not only of their engagement in certain of terrorist organizations, but simply health parameters will be monitored, and then we could see that Bentham's panopticon will be regarded as a nostalgic place in comparison of this overall control. But this is the dystopian vision, and I very much, as a human rights lawyer, would like to believe in another vision, because all these technologies are capable also of used in a different way when we include human rights analysis while designing this technology. So privacy enhancement or a certain control which people still have in their hands can be implemented in these policies. I think they often say track, trace, trust are going hand in hand. People would allow self-monitoring if they have a trust in political institution, or some of these tracking may not come from above, so it's not from top-down fashion, but it can be that people, civil organizations would have some control over it if that's the measures they want to implement in case of such a pandemic. But I see a dangerous tendency, and I think it's good for legal policymakers to identify that it's a different situation than the trade-offs between security and privacy, which we have already seen after September 11 in numerous countries, and since then, because of the biopolitical control. Often people will say, oh, it's just about the health, but it's a very sensitive healthcare data, and of course also social distancing, also of tracking different kind of connection between people would lead to an overall unprecedented monitoring of citizens.
That leads us very perfectly into our first question from the audience, Judith. Thank you, Judith, and thank you to the rest of the panel. And a reminder, please, to our audience that if you have any questions, you can type them directly into the Q&A. So the first question is, can we trust data from non-democracies? And Michael, I'm going to head straight over to you, first of all, for this one.
Yeah, thanks. So I would say that it depends on the objectives of the non-democratic country and the capacity of the state. Yeah. So Miklos has indicated how policymakers need to use data in real time. non-democracies that have high state capacity are doing that. So from high state capacity democracies, non-democracies, I don't believe that the data is fabricated, because they're using it to meet their own objectives, which is to reduce the spread of the pandemic. Maybe more controversially, can we trust the data in democracies? That's not, totally clear to me, actually. If we think about which type of politician has more of an incentive to make him or herself look good by fudging some data, it's those that are subject to political accountability. And democratic governments are subject to political accountability in ways that non-democratic governments are not. So from a purely kind of political economic point of view, we have some reason to believe that actually non-democratic governments have less of an incentive to misreport this data than democratic governments do. If you're interested in the paper, we have kind of a whole section dedicated to this topic, so I would invite you to check it out and see if you find it convincing.
Thanks, Michael. I think folk probably will. Miklos, Judith, would either of you like to also come in on that? Then I shall take us to the next question, which is, do the economic, political and ethical trade-offs involved in the collective right to health in a pandemic provide an opportunity to foreground attention to patterns of structural inequalities in terms of housing, income, access to health, and so on and so forth? Miklos, I'm going to pass that one to you first of all, if I may.
I do think that indeed this is going to come more to the foreground. And I'm thinking as an economist here, a lot of us like to do quantitative research, and we do research where we have hard data. And often it's very difficult to measure some of these inequalities. I mean, think about schooling, and the fact that in a lot of countries students were sent home and were tested. They should prepare on their own or with their parents' help at home for their school. Now, I think there are enormous inequalities in how much support students can get at home for their education, and what are the technological and other constraints that they are facing. But I think this way, these gaps have become much more visible. I think there's going to be lots of data where we can track how students have performed, performing next year, depending on how much of the material they have missed during this academic year. And I think that's going to kind of remind us economists that maybe the kind of things that we see in the data, maybe it's hiding some of these inequalities, and it's important to keep them in mind.
Thank you, Miklos. Judith, would you like to add anything to that, or shall we move on to our next question?
Just a very short answer, that I think that the pandemic is creating new vulnerabilities, and we still haven't have a full assessment of these conditions. So we tend to believe that I mentioned in the beginning of my introduction that we believed in the beginning that poor people will be more affected by the pandemics. It seems that public health had such a dimension which is affecting different groups than we thought, so that there is a high number of healthcare workers, for instance, who were influenced and infected by the virus. And also, of course, people in a different ages of their lifetime, their access to education would be of another issue. So I think that we have to also reconsider of the measures which we use for analyzing inequalities in the societies, because this pandemic created new forms of vulnerabilities.
Thank you. Moving on to the next question from our audience. This pandemic comes at the right moment to ease the pressure on economies all over the world. Do you think that professionals and ordinary people will learn from this and change their preferences? In other words, change their lifestyles? Who would like to take this one? Judith.
I I'm sure that all of us has something to say about this question because it's very important from ethical and legal perspectives. I think that, for instance, health was considered not such an important value in the last couple of years, and now we consider that perhaps there is a trade-off between competitiveness and health. We could see that health is interconnected with civil liberties, also other capacities to work. Actually, in the Inter-American Court of Justice already had this vision that we should not consider health as a kind of old-fashioned form of social welfare right, but it is a core and it's connected to several other civil liberties, because we cannot simply enjoy our rights if we don't have access to healthcare, for instance, and we cannot work. So that will rearrange, I think, the value system in many ways. I just wanted to reflect on how to right to health in connection with other civil liberties. We often considered a kind of hierarchy between our classical civil liberties and social welfare rights, and I think this will be also reconsidered in the context of the pandemics. But I'm sure my colleagues will also say something from economic perspectives.
Miklos, I'm going to pass over to you, please, to respond to that.
So I think in economics, I think the big question is how online technologies and working from home, how much of an effect it is going to have in the long run. And this is purely speculative, of course, because we're trying to predict the future here. But my prediction is that it might have an effect on long-range travel, long-range business travel, which of course is very, very detrimental to the climate. But I don't think cities are going to be much affected. Exactly because we have seen through the lens of history how important knowledge creation in the city has become. So I don't think like commuting patterns in the city and offices are still going to be here to stay, but maybe people are going to go on fewer long-range business trips, and that could be important.
Thanks. And then another question from our audience is...
Can I follow up quickly on Miklos's comment? Because I think the link between how people's preferences may change as a result of COVID-19 and the environment is actually a very pertinent one. So, these two problems are not totally dissimilar, right? So, in order to reduce climate change, people are going to have to accept kind of economic and mobility-related, trade-offs. They're going to have to give something up in order to reduce the pressure on the climate. What we've seen is that people really are quite reluctant to do that in COVID-19, at least in some democratic societies. And to me, that's concerning when we're going to need people to make similar concessions when a perhaps much larger and more existential global crisis hits us related to global warming. So I think that the connection between people's adjusted lifestyles and other types of global public goods problems is an important one to make.
Thank you. Judith, when you were speaking earlier, you mentioned 911, and I was just wondering, has there ever been a phenomenon that has ever approached the pandemic, like, for example, 911, but something else, in generating new research across so many disciplines? I'm thinking also perhaps about the Great Recession between 2007, 2009, varying from country to country. But is there anything else that springs to mind, or indeed, is there anything from which you could draw some parallels to the current situation in terms of your own research?
I think that I mentioned in the beginning of that there were some similar situations before when they considered that it's a public health emergency of international concern. That was the expressions, of course, Ebola and Zika, and a couple of other issues also of polio, for instance. But that time, the healthcare system looked very different, the normative system looked very different, and many people see parallel issues with the Spanish flu. But I think that what makes it still very different that in the last couple of decades, we got used to an autonomy-based healthcare system, that we decide what to do, we are the masters. We are selecting treatments. Actually, we can think about enhancement. Just in Hungary, for instance, just one example from my country, in December, we were shocked that the government offered of a full treatment of all IVF, in vitro fertilization services, very generously. That was discussed. And now we are struggling for basic health care. We understood this enormous dimension. We got used that we will select what form of pre-implantation genetic testings we shall use. We were contemplating on enhancement, genome editing. This was a completely different world. And since mid-March, people don't get access to healthcare services, basic necessity healthcare, and they understood that they are part of a kind of a public health system, which they totally forgot about. Although, of course, in the law, somewhere in a kind of dusty pages, you can find some strange measures of the quarantine. It has been always there since, I think the first quarantine laws came from the early medieval times from the city of Dubrovnik. And but it has been forgotten. We tend to believe that it's a part of the history books. We no longer has to know how shall we capable of complying with public health measures, because we believed in autonomy. If I have a good insurance, I have a good doctor, I decide what sorts of treatment I would like to opt, that everything is fine. And now we have to get used from me health to we health, in which there are for instance, immunity and also safety measures are collective dimensions. I think it will be parallel. Hopefully we will get back to the stage that we can still have a high tech in medicine, and hopefully we can use new technologies, artificial intelligence, and also helping to track certain tendencies to find good medications, a vaccine, etc. But I think that from now on, we have to learn a little bit of that my health is not just my issue, it's not just my individual concern, but it has also collective dimensions.
Thank you. Michael, that brings it back to the paradox of democracy. What overlap do you see with either the original question or what you've just been focusing on?
I'm sorry, the original question was?
About whether or not there has been anything that you can think of that could possibly approximate what we're seeing right now.
Yeah, well, I guess the thing that I'm focusing on in terms of like how to be helpful during this this period is instilling the notion in policymakers that they have to take really into consideration what the public will accept in terms of a policy response. Similarly, I think that it's incumbent upon us as academics and as public intellectuals to also educate the public about what they will have to give up in order for society to reach its goals. In this case, it's containing a pandemic, but in other future global crises, it will be some other type of concession that people will be asked to make. So I think from my point of view, those are the directions that I'll focus my efforts on.
Thanks, Michael. There's a question here, I think, that I'd like you to address, Miklos. Do you think that the research funding landscape will be skewed by short-termist focus on pandemic responses? And indeed, might this have an impact on the career opportunities of grad students and early career researchers?
That's a great question. So let me give you my perspective on this. So this journal that we published in, called COVID Economics, was started by CEPR in order to give timely policy advice during the time of the pandemic and the subsequent economic crisis. And by now there are 29 issues of this journal, about 200 papers published in this journal by economists. And I think it's great that academics are stepping up and spending a lot of time and research and energy and sharing their insights and helping the response. But I also think that this will not go on for a very long time, because this is a very intense response, taking a toll on researchers, depending on what other obligations they might have at home. So I'm fairly certain that, a year from now, suppose if the pandemic doesn't come back with more of a vengeance, and of course I don't know that, but then the landscape will not change that much, I think. So I would not kind of set out on a, I think it's fascinating to be thinking about these issues, and if you have research ideas that are kind of related to that, then by all means, and very important questions, but this is not all that we're going to be looking at, I think, in the next year or so.
Thank you. Michael first, and then Judith, please.
Yeah, I would maybe just respond very briefly to this one. My advice to PhD students who are interested in doing research on COVID-19 is to treat it as a special case of a more general problem that you want to investigate, right? So don't throw all your eggs into the COVID-19 basket, but instead just think of it as, a special case of a more general social phenomenon. In my case, it would be the political acceptability of intrusive regulatory policy, right? COVID-19 provides a good example of that more general concept, and I would encourage PhD students to think along those lines.
Thank you, Michael. Judith, over to you.
Because of my interest, I also work a lot with science journals and also with medical journals, and they have the same tendency that there are enormous publications interest to highlight the issues of COVID. And then there is an interesting tension between slow science and fast science and the fast track. So because of the pressure to find some remedies, some medications from vaccination, I think that there is a danger that this fast track, and also it can be observed in publications that they said if it's about the COVID, maybe we should give a green light faster than before. So the time in which the paper can be published about this issue has been significantly shorter, and many people issue the question of quality. Several papers had to be withdrawn even during this short period of time because of the fast publication of the results, which later on turned out not to be true, and some of the scientists had to apologize. It's about mask wearing, social distancing. Almost all measures have been reconsidered even during these months of COVID. So I think there is a tension between slow science and fast track publications and the quality, and in the same time to serve the huge public interest, to have something tangible, to have a result, to have a treatment therapy, and to have knowledge about of the spread of the COVID-19.
Thank you, Judith. I think we're getting towards the end of our times now, but I wonder whether or not we have one final question for the panel, a super speedy wrap-up question. So do please put your hands up who wants to go first. The question is, how do you believe the world will be altered as a result of COVID-19? Who wants to go first? Michael.
That's a very interesting question. I don't believe that I'm prepared to give a sufficient response other than maybe end from my end, from my point of view on a rather light note. For a brief moment in time, the introverts were in control. And as a nerdy academic, that period of time was not as bad for me as it was for others. So maybe, I don't know, maybe people will realize, as Miklos was so eloquently stating, that social interaction is not always necessary, and even when there's no risk of spreading a virus, people may adjust their behavior and take a quieter and more introverted lifestyle.
Judith, the same question to you, please. How do we alter it as a result of?
Yeah, I already gave a dystopian vision when Bentham's Panopticon will be a nostalgic place in comparisons of the overall monitoring as a result of the pandemics. And I would like to give as a utopistic version, which may be more appealing. Let's imagine a world with more solidarity, to recognize the public health issues, to spend more money on a healthcare system, and including privacy enhancement technologies when we are using new technologies in the field of healthcare. That's my dream.
I dream of seeing a world where the academics take control. Miklos, over to you.
So I can certainly relate to Michael's point. That was kind of how I felt in this past couple of months. I do see though that I think we're going to be probably more intentional about what communication and social interaction is about. When talking to students and business leaders, what we hear back really quite often, where talking means here online, that establishing trust is very difficult in an online context. You really need the face-to-face. I think if you kind of more intentional that, okay, I need this new business opportunity, so that's why I'm going to meet that person face-to-face. But now, we're working on a project. You can work from home and it's going to be totally fine. I think it's going to be meaningful change in that direction. But some of these interactions are here to stay.
So we're ending on a positive note for a rather extraordinary, and I swore I wouldn't use the word, but unprecedented situation. To our panel, thank you very much, Michael Dorsch, Miklos Koren, and Judith Shandor. Thank you for giving us your time this evening. To our audience, thank you very much for joining us for this event. And just as a reminder, it will be on our YouTube channel shortly. So we hope to see you at another event. Thank you very much, everybody. Stay safe.